Correspondent with the BBC for more than 25 years and has been based in Colombo, Washington, Istanbul, Brussels and Delhi, to name but a few. He was the BBC's global trade correspondent before leaving the corporation early this year, so you're in immensely good hands. So with that said, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you very much, Freddie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for coming, to those of you in the room and also those of you watching online. The new leader has been chosen and the people have not been consulted. But that's enough about Britain. Because we're here to talk about China, which, let's face it, is a lot more important. And the Party Congress in Beijing, as you know, has come to an end, and Xi Jinping, to no one's surprise, has secured a third five-year term as leader of the Communist Party and strengthened his grip as China's most powerful leader since Mao. So we're going to hopefully discuss a little bit about what this might mean, read some of the runes and some of the themes emerging from the Party Congress with our panel of experts. And just to talk in terms of process, I'll introduce them in a second. What I'll do is ask each of them to speak for a few minutes at the beginning, then I will ask some questions, we'll have a discussion, and of course we'll be very happy to take questions, and we want to have questions from the floor, and also for those of you listening online, if those questions want to come from those of you listening elsewhere, please do put the questions in the chat, and I'm assured that they will make their way to me, probably by the old-fashioned method of somebody passing me a piece of paper. So, as Freddie said, I've been based in lots of places around the world, but I've never been based in Beijing, so cards on the table, I'm not a China expert, but we're very fortunate to have a panel of people who are. Everywhere I have been based, of course, the topic of the role of China and the rise of China has never been very far from the surface, and it's more important today than ever. So let me introduce our panel from the far side. Actually, no, I'm going to start on the big screen. There's no one there at the moment. She is there? She's on mute. I'm hoping that Elizabeth Palmer can hear me. Elizabeth is CBS News' senior foreign correspondent currently covering Asia, which obviously includes a lot of work on the state of the relationship between the United States and China. Elizabeth has just arrived in Tokyo from Hong Kong, from where she was covering the Party Congress, having not, I understand, been given entry to the event itself in Beijing. Elizabeth, I don't know if you can hear me. Perhaps? Hello, Elizabeth, can you hear me? Let's hope you can. I'm going to introduce the people in the room first, and maybe we can come back to you in a moment if you're not there. So, with me on the panel, Dr. Yu Jie is a senior research fellow on China in the Asia-Pacific program at Chatham House. Writing and talking frequently about Chinese affairs, rather a lot, I suspect, in the last few days. James King is the global China editor of the Financial Times and also editor of the newsletter Tech Asia. And closest to me, Isabel Hilton is the founder of China Dialogue, an independent organization which is dedicated in particular to promoting a common understanding of China's urgent environmental challenges. Is Elizabeth there? Elizabeth, can you hear me? Not at the moment. Oh, she's well spotted. Admit to the room. Excellent. Tell you what, while we're waiting for Elizabeth to connect, I am going to ask Yu Jie to perhaps say a few words to begin with. In particular, I guess, I mean, we've all, you in particular, been reading the runes of what happened at the Party Congress, but looking at what was said in Xi Jinping's speech the previous weekend and then the comments he made yesterday.
Sure. Firstly, thank you, Chris. Delighted to be here and to share some of my thoughts with card members.
Could you, for the benefit of people listening online? Yeah.
Okay. Now you can all hear me now. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Really delighted to be here, and also thanks so much for Premier to have invited me to join the Frontline Club and to have this timely discussion, but somehow also quite strange, as we just got Prime Minister confirmed, and for China yesterday, it's not just the Prime Minister or the President, but we have the Chinese The Privy Council, as well as an equivalent 1992 committee, got confirmed over the weekend. So, which means the Politburo and also the Central Committee. What really tells us? This will really tell us that we're now going to be facing a China that began to looking inward and become far more interested in fixing its own domestic economic woes, and become far more interested that looking at the world slightly in a more dangerous way, looking at the world slightly in a more cautious way, no longer really just open arms, like embracing the foreign direct investment, like what we have experienced in the last 40 years. So that really setting the tone of this Congress. I mean, regardless of what happened on stage at the People's Great Hall of the People on Saturday, I mean, really the condition of Hu Jintao, I have absolutely no idea. But really judging from the composition of Standing Committee of Politburo, so the team of 7, at the apex of power, and also judging by the composition of Politburo, that team of 24, by the way, not 25, 24. For the first time for 20 years, since 2002, 16th Party Congress, we have now have an even number Politburo, which means the time when you come to casting a vote on important issues such as Taiwan, and you probably can't make a very quick decision because you have an even number, not odd number for that. Now, secondly, this Politburo and also Standing Committee is full of convention-busting nominees. So there's 3 conventions that's been broke as of yesterday. Firstly, the age limit. We all know that for the age limit, for those who at age of 68 should really step down, and for those who are 67, you got promoted and you whether stay for the next 5 years or so on and so forth. But that did not happen yesterday. So yesterday what we had is we have someone who's extremely close to Xi Jinping at the Central Military Commission, and he's age 72 and got confirmed to stay at the Politburo. And we also have the current Chinese Foreign Minister, again, he's age 69 and got allowed to stay in power. So that is one age issue for those who should be promoted, but younger, but asked to leave. That's one convention being broken. Now, the second convention in here is you're always supposed to have a woman at the Politburo, the equivalent 1992 committee of the Chinese Communist Party. But for this time, we have absolutely not a single female had made to the Politburo at all. And again, I think the last time we had this was probably about 30 years ago. So that's another mess. And the 2 likely contenders, I think the reason why they got turned down is because the 2 likely contenders are not have been occupied in a high office for long enough. So that's the reason why they did not really get promoted. Now, last convention in here is quite interesting, is this very surprising appointment of someone who is supposed to be in charge of the Chinese economy, but has never run the state council, has never worked within the state council, which is the equivalent of the Chinese government. So you have the party, you have the government, you have the Chinese government. The person have not really run the government, the central government, have only run Shanghai, and to be promoted as the premier of the country in charge of the economic planning. And judging by his record, I mean, I can only judge by result. It's really a mixed responses what he has handled. Firstly, someone who's very close to private sector. So he used to be friends with Alibaba, with Jack Ma, because he run provinces like Zhejiang, Jiangsu, and Shanghai, which is the equivalent economic powerhouse of China. But on the other hand, given his mishandling of the lockdown in Shanghai, this really could somehow foreshadow his premiership by running the Chinese economy. So again, whether he was able to coordinate and facilitate that sense of cooperation between Xi Jinping and himself and the State Council, that would really remain to be seen. So I think there's 3 convention-busting things which really should take me by shock. Now, another thing which really taking me by shock in here, on the very final point, is that we're now having this Politburo of 24 people, and 7 of them have earned a PhD in natural science or environmental science, and they earned that PhD themselves from the very, very early age. And they are either nuclear specialist or the person that designed China's first spacemanship and sent it to, so a rocket man. And then you also have someone who's deeply care about environment, and someone with a PhD degree from Imperial College, and now sitting on the Politburo. So that really tells us this is going to be a country that's going to formulate policy. It's not just based on economics and finance like what we had in the past, but instead, it is a policy that we're going to have is the policy that look into technology, the policy that deeply look into education, the policy that deeply look into fixing its own domestic problems. So it is not something that deeply popular among the foreign investors, but perhaps that's what China is needed right now.
Lovely, thank you very much. I can now see Elizabeth on screen. Elizabeth, hi, can you hear me? It's Chris here in London.
I can, Chris. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear, and I know you can't see the audience, but we can see you on a large screen. So welcome to the Conduit Club. I suspect you may not have heard my introduction, but we have the panel here on stage who I think you can see, and I was asking each of you to maybe just make a few opening remarks. I know you've just come back from Hong Kong. It's very late there, so thanks for joining us so late in the evening. Perhaps you'd just like to spend a couple of minutes just giving your impressions of the Party Congress and where we are now, in particular with relation, of course, given your job, to what it means for the all-important relationship between China and the United States.
I should start by saying that I'm not in Beijing because the Chinese won't give me a visa. And that is because the State Department and the Chinese government are locked in a tit-for-tat, deny journalist visas to one another. And that, to me, is a symbol of how uncooperative and scratchy the relationship is. And neither side seems to want to give an inch. China is at the moment also not being very generous with visas with foreign journalists, probably because it doesn't really want more foreign scrutiny. But that does mean that I'm locked out of what ought to be my posts, and I'm not the only one. This region is full of journalists who should be based in China, who can't be based in China. They're either here or in Hong Kong or in Taiwan. And that really bodes very ill for the future, because the number of people who are really in China, eyes on, reporting to the West, has diminished drastically during COVID-19. And it doesn't look as if it's going to reverse itself anytime soon, even though probably the COVID quarantine restrictions and so on might lighten up, but that doesn't mean that journalists will follow or be able to come and go freely. I was in Hong Kong during the party conference, and what struck me was how the Hong Kong government, certainly the people, were watching with huge interest and some uncertainty. I think because after the democracy protests in Hong Kong, there was a lot of talk about how China had cracked down and enacted the Basic Law and basically snuffed out freedom of speech. That's all true. But Hong Kong is still not China, you know, so that I, on a British passport, and my cameraman on an American passport, could go in visa-free. I mean, that's extraordinary. China is just not like that at all. But the Hong Kong government is still trying to maintain its separate system, one country, two systems, but very much sort of trying to keep Beijing happy. And you can see it in the way their COVID is a sort of zero COVID light. They try and please Beijing, I think, try and play the game, even though in so many other ways, like visas and for example, like the opening up of the country to foreign business is quite radically not like China. And I was just struck by how Hong Kong is on edge and not quite sure what to expect from China, even though nominally it's part of China. So I'll stop there and let somebody else take over, and maybe we can come back to that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elizabeth. James, let's go to you next. I know you've, because you told me, you've been writing a What Does It All Mean piece for the Financial Times today, so perhaps you can give us a sneak preview. What does it all mean?
Or perhaps not. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks, Chris. I think at times like this, you know, journalists tend to write that this is a watershed moment. And I'd like to just try to refine that a little bit according to what I think. I think it is a very major watershed moment politically for a lot of the reasons that Yujie has just mentioned. But I don't think it's a watershed moment economically or strategically for China. Perhaps I can just go into those a little bit. I don't want to repeat what Yujie mentioned, but politically, obviously, Xi Jinping gets a third term. That is unprecedented since the days of Mao. And also breaks all kinds of precedent and conventions in who he chooses, the makeup of the Politburo, what the jobs of the key 7 members of the Politburo are going to be doing, and what experience they have. All of that is different. He's tearing up the internal rule book in China. And I think that's important as a statement by itself, because I think that shows the kind of person that we're dealing with here. Xi Jinping is not somebody who is going to allow niceties, legal or otherwise, to restrain his actions and ambitions in the world. I think that's the key point. So politically, it's a massive shift. This stuff is really very important in China for all kinds of reasons, hopefully we can discuss. Economically and strategically, I think what this Congress represents is a reaffirmation and an intensification of really important world-changing trends that, if you've been watching China, you would be aware of. So economically, China is building a fortress economy. In other words, more self-reliance, more indigenous innovation, stripping out reliance on virtually any foreign technology that China can manage. Of course, the big vulnerability here is semiconductors, but I'm sure we'll discuss that. Basically, I think what Xi Jinping is trying to do is to build a techno-authoritarian state, by which I mean a world-leading technological power. And I believe that people might be quite surprised to know in how many areas of technology China is already leading the world. I won't go into a long list, but we can discuss that. It really is a technological peer or rival, or in some cases already overtaking the US. And I expect, Xi Jinping's ambition is to redouble efforts in that regard so that China becomes the unassailable technological leader in the world. And personally, I wouldn't bet against him being successful. But, this process will, as I mentioned, require much greater self-reliance, much greater reduction on outside influences. So I'm talking about import of food. I'm sure there's a climate change element to this. Renewables, obviously China needs to deepen its reliance on renewables so that it can reduce the 20% of its energy that it currently gets in seaborne oil imports, because that represents a strategic vulnerability with the rest of the world. Lastly, strategically, I would say what we're going to be looking at is an intensification of current trends, which means much greater tensions over Taiwan and in the South China Sea. Effectively, I think Xi Jinping is trying to build a country that can withstand a war. Please notice I didn't say prepare for war. I said withstand a war. In other words, it's not my belief that China wants to have a war with Taiwan or the US, but it is prepared that might be the eventuality. And I think the date for this, such a calamitous event, has probably been brought forward over the last, several months. Certainly what I've been hearing from Chinese sources in the last month or two suggests that maybe the thinking for such, the date for such an event has been brought forward. However, just 3 big risks to this scenario. First, obviously, is what I've just been talking about, the risk of conflict with Taiwan, conflict in the South China Sea, even potentially superpower conflict. The next one is that all of these economic policies may not drive growth or engender growth. They could actually smother Chinese economic growth. And that's going to be really bad for the world because China's contributed way more to global growth than any other economy, about 25% over the last decade. So that's not something I think people should look forward to, but it is beginning, I would say, to be a believable scenario. And the last thing I think is related to the economic picture, which is the huge gulf now between rhetoric and reality, by which I mean China is decoupling economically from the outside world, and everybody's writing about this, but much fewer words are spent writing about the reality, which is that we are very much coupled. I was buying kettles over the weekend, ended up with a very nice brand, I must say, but I looked at all of the kettles, they're all made in China. There's no decoupling going on whatsoever in John Lewis or Currys or B&Q, right? So I think, we need to recognize the fact that there is a massive gulf between the rhetoric and the reality, and if we follow the rhetoric, we are headed into a very big disruption in the world economy.
Yeah, thanks very much, James. I noticed in the political report, it specifically mentioned, didn't it, supply chains and the need for them to become much more self-reliant and self-controlled. And I was thinking, was that partly a sort of post-COVID measure, but also possibly preparing for a possible confrontation? Isabel.
Just on that point, I think, again, that's not new. We're seeing a deepening of that trend, but so-called dual circulation has been a policy for some time. And that is about China being resilient in terms of potentially hostile external pressures. And I agree with everything that's been said about the trends. I think it's important to understand what tearing up the rules means. Xi Jinping has torn up the rules. Who wrote the rules and why were they written? It was essentially Deng Xiaoping who wrote the rules, and he wrote them in order to avoid having an ideologically dominant and politically dominant authoritarian state, led by a personality cult. And guess what? This is beginning to remind me of the China that I first knew decades ago, which was the tail end of the Mao Zedong era, when ideology was in command, politics was in command. We're hearing echoes of this language absolutely everywhere. Now, that's in a sense China's choice, although who chooses, of course, you could contest. But what Xi Jinping is creating is a state in which, China is the party, and the party is Xi Jinping. And the potential dangers of that, I think we can see from any number of previous examples, including previous examples in China, where you have a system which in some ways can get things done, where I'm often asked on the climate front, where aren't there advantages in having a top-down system? And, in some ways there are. We can exaggerate how effective it is in China. But the downside is that it finds it extraordinarily difficult to self-correct, that when things go wrong in a system like that, when the wrong decisions are made, it takes a very long time, and a lot of damage has to be done before the system can pull back. And, again, from the Mao Zedong era, there are any number of examples, the worst of which was the Great Leap Forward. But I would argue that zero COVID is one such. We're still in zero COVID in China, and we're in zero COVID in China not for particularly good reasons at this point, but it is heavily identified with the great leader, and so it is extremely difficult to change, to correct, and what happens in those circumstances is that officials at every level across China over-enact the policy in order to please the boss and demonstrate their loyalty. So the kind of qualities that you need to demonstrate to thrive in that sort of system are not necessarily the ones that are good either for the local economy or for sound policy making. So that's a big danger. The second trend that I think we see deepened in the 20th Party Congress, again not a huge surprise, is the securitization of everything. And again, that's been kind of building. So the number of things which are now described as matters of national security go from, feminism to LGBTQ questions to any kind of divergence of opinion. these can all be described as national security. I mean, again, we saw it enacted in Hong Kong in a rather brutal kind of lesson in how you bring a very vibrant society like Hong Kong into line. But of course in China, you know, this is now pretty standard fare. And I'm sure my fellow panelists have had the experience of, you know, the falling away of Chinese contacts and friends and conversations, the thinning out of people-to-people contact, because it's simply, you know, people are rightly concerned about the consequences of talking to foreigners anymore. And that's not great for China's relations with and understanding of the world, or the world's relationship with and understanding about China. On the personnel, I did note that Chen Shuangguo, who was the man who brought Tibet and Xinjiang in particular into line, talking of security, was retired. I don't know, perhaps he's fulfilled his purpose, but he's no longer there. It was early retirement, yeah. I mean, he didn't have to retire, so he was retired, and that's an interesting one. On the other hand, Wang Hongning, who is the chief ideologue of the Xi Jinping era, is still very much there. So those are kind of slight bellwethers. On my particular topic, it was disappointing to note how little mention there was of climate. You know, China has aligned its industrial policy in many ways towards climate change. It's not that China does nothing. China does a lot. The mitigation side, however, has slowed down, again for energy security reasons in the last 3 or 4 years. There was talk of coal, again, a promotion of coal as some kind of clean fuel, which is disappointing given how much coal China burns. So in that sense, we can see other concerns overtaking what had been quite a kind of powerful signature policy of Xi Jinping. He was pretty front-footed on climate, but again, we're seeing a correction because of geopolitics. Shall I stop there?
Thank you very much. So a couple of questions from me. First one perhaps for Yuzhe and for Elizabeth, from slightly different perspectives. I mean, Yuzhe, you talked about the standing committee of 7 men, all men, as you said, the Politburo of 24. But is it really, building on what Isabel was saying, all about one man now? And I wonder what the perspective, Elizabeth, on that from the United States is as well, about how much they are dealing with a single figure, or whether there are other kind of contacts that can usefully be had. Yuzhe, maybe you could go first.
Well, of course it's about one person, but on the other hand, I think there's also to do with the policy itself that where Xi Jinping want to drive to China. So we come back to these ideas on self-reliance. You see the current Politburo appointments that all point towards to having a more sophisticated industrial policy, to have more sophisticated education policy that would be able to grooming the next generation homegrown talents that will be able to solve the readiness on the semiconductors and many other leading technologies. So that was the point. I think the point is let's not just focusing on one person, but it's really this one person have appointed all the rest of 6 plus 24, 30 people, and really for formulating a policy of self-reliance or fortress China, James was talking about in here. Now, on the other hand, is also we have seen that the very popular in the past, you know, the all-seasons economists, the economists and also this, you know, liberal view type of politicians are now being put aside. Those who have a very close association with the United States. So for me, that is almost a very clear signal that the party has chosen to somehow decouple from the United States itself. So I think it's more about self-inviting to do what they want to do and to shape China according to his view of the world. And this is also going back to the issue back to his childhood, you know, someone who lived in a family that is deeply political, but also had a quite turbulent few years of his childhood, and also sent to countryside, spent 7 or 8 years in the deep west of China. So I think this all sense of lack of security, that sense of strong insecurity, has also prompted him to shape China according to his view of the world.
Thanks. I believe we've lost Elizabeth at the moment. So a question for James and for Isabel about economic growth, really. I mean, I believe the estimate is perhaps it'll be about 3% this year, so well below the target of 5.5%. what does that mean, James, for China? What does it mean for the rest of us? And Isabel in particular, what do you think that means about climate change policy? Does it mean that a slowdown of decarbonisation, or possibly could it mean, well, here's a way we can increase the pace of decarbonisation to encourage growth in a different way?
Well, I think one interesting angle on what it means is looking at the Hang Seng stock index in Hong Kong. I just had a look at it this morning. It's down to where it was just before the 1997 handover of Hong Kong from the UK to China, which is, I would say, a huge indictment of where money thinks it should go. I mean, yeah, as you say, so this year the World Bank is predicting 2.8% growth for China, which is down from 5.5% target. But I think something much more important is happening here, and that is, goes back to what Isabel was saying about the securitization of everything. You know, we've lived in China over the last 40 years. I first went to China in 1982, believe it or not, as a student. I've seen the last 40 years, and we've been used to seeing China gunning the growth engines. It's all been about growth. It's all been about maximizing returns, profits, etc. But now it's not. It just isn't. It's about security. And that's why the word security was mentioned, what was it, 68 times in the work report? 73? And the economy, do you remember? 68. So, yeah, that's brilliant. So, you know, I think that really says an awful lot. That is different, by the way, from the past, if you look at those words in previous reports. But it's much more textured than that. If you look into all of the policies in the economy, the way the government is looking at fostering technological development and innovation, very little of it these days is about maximizing growth. It's all about maximizing China's strategic advantage. So that is a very, very different direction. That is a fundamentally different direction when you consider that, as I said, China's driven the world economy for at least 15 years.
And all of that is true. What that doesn't do is help local governments or provincial governments solve their very big economic problems. And, you know, the problem of lack of growth in China is that, you know, there is still a population that needs to be kept reasonably happy, and they have a lot of reasons to be unhappy right now. 20% youth unemployment. The kind of, you know, 10-year outlook includes the world's most rapidly aging population, a lot of unfunded pensions, the collapse of local government revenues, which depended on a property sector substantially, and that property sector is in this extraordinary slow-motion bankruptcy, which again is creating unhappiness among people who've actually paid for apartments that have not yet been built and may not be built. So, you know, there's a lot going on there. There are banks that aren't paying out on you know, deposits. There's just a sense of kind of fragility in the economy from the popular level that I think is trouble. And the other thing I would say is that one of the when we looked at, for example, COVID recovery plans, which from the perspective of people who care about climate change, were a fantastic opportunity given the disruption in systems and the disruptions that had taken place because of the pandemic in the way we do things. They were a huge opportunity to accelerate a transition, a green transition. But when you looked at what China was doing, it was depressingly similar to the post-financial crash stimulus, which was a massive kind of concrete and steel pour, you know, kind of let's build more infrastructure, all of that kind of thing. You know, the cheap hit, if you like, which, again, you know, 10 years on had left enormous problems of debt, hadn't created a lot of value, but had created a lot of churn. And there was quite a lot of that, again, in the post-COVID stimulus. On the positive side, you know, China's been experimenting with things like circular economy and all of that, and that continues. But, you know, as it often is in China, it's a tale of many countries and you know, many different effects. So I don't think one can say positively that lower growth is good for the climate. It equally well might stimulate another round of pouring concrete just to get the figures up.
One more question from me, and then I'll look for some questions from the audience. A question to all three of you, really, on Taiwan. And the language promoted by Xi last week has got tougher. What should we read into that? Is it just rhetoric? Does it mean more than that? James, you've already mentioned you think that there's preparations underway for a possible confrontation. And in particular, I'm interested, I guess, in the context of, whoever you are, wherever in the world, events in Ukraine must have given anyone who thinks they may be heading for a conflict with a potentially weaker neighbour some pause for thought. So the issue of Taiwan in general, I don't know who wants to go first.
Yes, recovering Taiwan, yes, they mean it. I think it's Xi Jinping's, if there's one great task left to perform, and if you see yourself as a figure of historic dimensions, it seems that he does, then that's the obvious one. How and when, of course, remain unclear. The military modernization has been brought forward. A lot of talk about the military in the work report. I like to think that, according to Sun Tzu, the best war is the one you don't actually have to fight. And I like to think that remains the preferred option. And what does that mean? Well, it means outflanking the US presence, for example, by finishing those security negotiations with small Pacific Island states, thus getting beyond the first island chain. It means using all the other forms of pressure that you can use in Taiwan, including economic, including disruption of the Taiwanese faith in democracy by the usual ways, the sort of thing we've seen over the past decade there and elsewhere. And hoping that perhaps a Kuomintang government will come to power and that a new conversation can be started. I mean, that's what I would prefer to do if I was Xi Jinping and achieve a peaceful, quote-unquote, a reunification. But you can't rule out that, if that doesn't go well and if things go very badly in China and a distraction and adventure seems like a better option, there might be one. I think it would be pretty catastrophic and could escalate very, very quickly into a broader war. If I were a Chinese military planner and looking at this, I think, well, I'd have to take out the American assets in the region. Then, you have to attack Okinawa. You have to look seriously at South Korea. It's an extremely dangerous proposition, which is why I still think that they'll try and do it the other way.
Yes, just briefly, I would tend to agree with that. I still think that the Chinese leadership is a rational actor. And my basis for saying that is, if you look at the way they make policy, I mean, the reams of documents, the level of detail, it is far and away so much more impressive than what happens in this country, for instance. No, I mean, it's on a different planet. I mean, maybe it's too much, I'm not sure. But this is a bureaucracy of highly intelligent, well-trained, smart people. They may have other failings, but I would say that is certainly true. And their ability to master detail and to think policies through has always been really very impressive. Now, we may be moving into an era where that is no longer the case, and China suddenly stops being a rational actor. And under those circumstances, which I don't think we've reached yet, but it's possible to see a Politburo full of all Xi's men, loyalists toadying up to him, whatever. You can see that kind of potential scenario now, probably for the first time. It's possible that China will cease to be a rational actor, in which case I think all bets are off with Taiwan. But as things stand, I very much agree with Isabel. It's not in China's interest at this moment or even in 5 years from now to launch a war against Taiwan. Just think of what could happen. China imports a huge percentage of its food. There could be sanctions imposed by the US or others to prevent it from getting food. It imports 80% of its semiconductors. All of its vaunted tech industry depends on those semiconductors. There could be sanctions on those too. It uses the US dollar for more than 90% of its trade. Look at what happened with Russia. Through the SWIFT mechanism, there was big sanctions imposed on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. The same could happen with China. Look at energy. We mentioned 20% of seaborne imports of oil and gas. So China faces massive potential economic disruptions if the US decides to really go the full, isolation of China, blockade China route. And therefore, my analysis has always been China won't attack Taiwan for a good many years to come. But notwithstanding that, I have to say, in the last few weeks, as I mentioned earlier, I've spoken to senior Chinese, or I should say, formerly senior Chinese officials who are now no longer in the government, who think that it could happen within 5 years. So, I think it's a really, really major issue.
Well, interestingly, entirely agree with what Isabel and James said in here. I think the best option for Xi Jinping is still the so-called peaceful reunification. Hence, that phrase, that term of peaceful reunification was there, I think, ever since 1992. So that baseline has not changed. Now, what has changed is, apart from the personnel appointment that really catch the mainstream media headline here, is actually the party charter, party constitution revision. Now, within the party constitution revision, there's no additional line added that the party is going to crush those who are seeking independence within Taiwan. Now, that line is very new, which means that it's a kind of upgrade regarding the rhetorics towards Taiwan. But then on the other hand, also let's look into the personal appointment and also policy. People who are in charge of the Taiwan policy has not even made to the Central Committee. So didn't even make the equivalent of the 1992 committee for the Chinese Communist Party, which means that that is not yet, in the next 5 years, a policy priority for China. So really from the personal appointment level, it looks as if the Taiwan issue is remaining going to hang there and also require creative solutions. And I don't think Xi Jinping can offer any creative solution at this stage. Now, secondly, if we're speaking from the societal level, both from mainland China side and also from the side of Taiwan, we all end up in a one-child family, and including myself. And I don't think the Chinese middle-class parents are willing to send their only child to fight a war that is absolutely unnecessary. Okay? So that would, for me, is not the bottom line for the political thinking. It's the societal constraint against Xi Jinping that would stop him to launching a potential military escalation towards Taiwan. If you actually observe Xi Jinping's responses in August for Pelosi's visit, was actually quite restrained compared with what people might think of. So I think where we are is we're now in a we're just on the verge of things. But what would be really scary is that both China and the United States sleepwalk into a conflict that neither Washington nor Beijing wanted, firstly. And secondly, because of lack of communication between the two sides, and this put in a very difficult situation.
Great, thanks. I've got plenty of other questions, but let's take some from the floor. There should be microphones coming around, so maybe we can take 3, and we'll take them in groups. So I see all the hands. I will, gentleman there. The woman here and the gentleman at the front, and then I'll come to the other ones in the second round.
Hello, my name is Baranaygan and I'm coming from KCL War Studies, and my question was about the security issues of China. Do you think that with the regional comprehensive economic partnership agreement that has been effective this year, is it likely for there to be less maritime border issues in the South China Sea? Or do you think the rising anxiety of security issues of China will still continue to rise in the conflicts in the region?
Okay, and then the woman here.
Hi, thanks for the talk, it's really interesting. My question was just about the military modernization issue and recruitment. Is there any way for kind of journalists and China watchers and outsiders to have a view into the situation with PLA recruitment, the quality of the army? People talk about the education of the recruits and so on, because, I guess the quality of the army is an important issue.
Okay, the gentleman in the front row here, the microphone's just coming.
Good afternoon. we talk about the rise of China, but we sometimes forget that this country, together with other European nations, actually basically took over the world over 100 years ago. And we did it by force. And to a large extent, I don't think China has done such a thing. They might have done it through economic reasons, but they haven't gone in, sort of, generally speaking, just taken over nations, like, for example, this country did with places like India and parts of Africa. So that's one part. And the second thing is, am I correct in saying that one of the problems with China, and you mentioned that you're an only child, is that they've got an ageing population and their economy will slow down purely because of that?
Okay, so security issues, South China Sea and so forth, recruitment into the PLA, and I guess, does China have some kind of colonial policy, and the issue of demographics? So there's quite a lot to get into. I'm going to go for Isabel first.
Gee, thanks.
So you can pick whichever question you like. You go first. You get to pick the one you answer.
True. Demographics, absolutely. As I said, China has the world's most rapidly aging population. A lot of the pensions are unfunded. They have reversed the one-child policy. First, they made it a two-child policy. Then they made it a three-child policy, and then they made it a, oh, please have a baby policy. And actually, they haven't had a lot of response. And the whole one-child policy was extremely brutal. And it was a classic example of a kind of pointless policy, because if you look at what actually changes demographics, it's development, it's giving women choices, it's all those, it's urbanization. And if you track the populations of the countries around China, the Asian tigers that developed first, they all ended up with much, lower birth rates, and China has got there via development, but also with a one-child policy. But now, urban couples in small apartments, they don't want to have lots of children. And I would predict that one of the less attractive possibilities is that, there will be far more kind of pressure put on women to stay at home and have children if this goes on, if they find that they're not doing it voluntarily. There was another question. What was it? And well, yeah, China isn't a classic 18th or 19th century imperial power in the way that Britain was. On the other hand, if you look at the borders of China in 1644, if you look at where the Great Wall is, it's in the middle of the country. So the idea that China has never expanded into other territories is frankly not sustained by historical maps. It is a land-based empire, which expanded largely under the Manchu, under the Qing dynasty, and those expanded borders were reclaimed by successor states as eternal borders of China. China now argues a completely different story, but, why build the Great Wall in the middle of the country? If it was a defensive fortification against non-Chinese peoples. I rest my case.
James, I don't know if you can, the issue of the recruitment of the PLA, I don't know if that's your...
I'm sorry, that's above my pay grade. All I can say is generalities, really. I mean, I don't, report on the military, but from what I hear, China's military these days is pretty impressive, and some of the recent military exercises, I think particularly the one done with Russia, showed very good communication between the three arms of the People's Liberation Army. That's about all I can say. The other thing is I think is important to note is the very rapid nuclear missile buildup, and the fact that Xi Jinping mentioned in the report to the Congress strategic deterrence. I believe that was the first time that China's used that. And China's got a hypersonic missile, which the US hasn't got. China's presence in space is right there with the US, I think, technologically. They're not giving up any ground in terms of space technology to the US. They've got some extraordinary things up there. I mean, they've got these grappling modules, I think they're called modules, that can basically just sidle up to a satellite that's sort of hanging there in space and just pick it up and throw it out of orbit. It's a very, very interesting arena up there. So, but I'm sure that won't satisfy the questioner. I'm not an expert on recruitment, I'm afraid. Just one other thing on demography. I would say what a lot of people, World Bank, many other think tanks around the world have been calling on China to do has been to expand its social security network. Because, of course, if you've got 6 kids, supporting, if you've got 1 kid supporting 6 elders, as you are going to have as the demographic pyramid inverts, then it's really important to give that person help in terms of pensions, medical care, etc. But the way policy is in China at the moment is that it doesn't appear to be looking at that very strongly. Xi Jinping has said that we must resist the Western disease of welfarism. So I think that's a big issue, actually. It's very, very nerdy. I spent 2 days recently trying to educate myself on what is happening, what isn't happening in China's social welfare system. But the short answer is that it's very much underfunded. And I think that spells rather anemic consumer growth in the future as all of these families wrestle with the pressures that Isabel just described, living in an apartment, very high education costs, right from a kindergarten all the way through for the 1 kid that you've got, very high medical costs. I'll just tell you a little anecdote. I went with a colleague in China to one of the best hospitals in Beijing. His lung had collapsed, and it was an emergency, so I drove him there. We got there, and the doctor said to me, my colleague is literally gasping beside me, and the doctor says, okay, you can see the trainee, that'll cost you 200 renminbi, or you can see the specialist right now, that'll cost you 2,500. So of course we saw the specialist. That's the type of hidden cost that you find in the Chinese economy everywhere. And I think that's why Chinese are not spending much these days. They're all saving for a rainy day.
Yujie, and in particular, maybe on the security issues as well.
Sure,
In South China Sea.
on RCEP issues. I think it's the RCEP he's asking. So basically, it's the regional economic cooperation partnership, the trade deal that led by ASEAN, led by China, by the way, led by ASEAN, and China is the major beneficiary for that. Why is this the case, and why is this perhaps would reduce the likelihood of South China Sea conflicts? I think the reasoning here is following, that China actually enjoyed a huge trade surplus, I think, with those 16 different Southeast Asia countries, and all this trade surplus are much greater than the United States. So Beijing naturally considered this RCEP would be a trump card, countering against the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy offered by the United States. So generally using that economic means, the financial resources, to extend the political and the military influence within the region. So I think really for United States, if really want to make Indo-Pacific strategy to work, they will have to working from the economic aspect, but not necessarily on the military aspect, because again, Southeast Asia already has been one of the most contested region. And for most of the smaller and medium-sized country, they would prefer not to choose between Beijing or Washington. But at the end of the day, I think we might have to bear that reality. Now, on the point on the demographics and also productivity, I think part of the reason why Xi Jinping introduced not technology, but the education after tutorial crackdown for the previous year, it is to encourage more young couples to have more children, because those tutorials are extremely expensive. And therefore, that would really constrain the capabilities of young couple having more children, and therefore have to spend all that money, send them to the tutorial class. So I think that's also come back to a deeper reason, because really for the demographic reason, they probably have to stop those after tutorial class. So that's a way of tackling the demographic decline. But it can only be mitigated, but not reverse the trend, I'm afraid.
So many issues we can talk about. Just one more question from me before I'll come back to the questions on the floor. One thing that really struck me was that last week, the idea of Xi Jinping thought is now officially at the core of Communist Party ideology. What should we read into that? Is that a vanity project? Does it have practical implications for the way things happen? I noticed that the main article yesterday or today in the Times talked about, I think its opening sentence was that this is the the harbinger of a new era of totalitarianism in China, which is quite a strong word. But I don't know who wants to talk about Xi Jinping thought and what it means in practice.
Well, it expands the field of political crime. I mean, if you disagree with Xi Jinping thought, that is no longer just a political disagreement. That's a disagreement with the party and therefore with the country and therefore a matter of national security. So yeah, it does matter. It's part of the embedding of Xi Jinping at the heart of the core, as they would say, of the party and the national interests. So he becomes an untouchable figure, and his thought becomes effectively law.
I think that covers it. Unless
That covers it, and actually the statement, Xi Jinping's speech on Saturday effectively said that. It effectively said the Central Committee, I can't remember all of the categories, but basically the Central Committee downward pledged to uphold and support Xi Jinping thought in every arena in China. So there it is. It's exactly what Isabel said. You know, if you disagree, you're disagreeing with the party, and that is, well, it's not good.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually full name. It's not Xi Jinping thought. It's a Xi Jinping thought with the socialist character in the new era. Mm-hmm. And as many like nerdy China observers or wonks like myself, we really wonder what is it, the actual word Xi Jinping thought being put into the party constitution, or the longer version. So back to the 19th Party Congress 5 years ago, it was the longer version put there, and this time still is the longer version. And he hasn't got that, capability to reduce into 5 by saying Xi Jinping thought, because that put him on a par with Mao Zedong, and I don't think he can afford to do that at this moment. But maybe later in the next 5 years, who knows?
Okay, question. So we've got, let's take 2 right at the back, and then there's a lady here. And so I see the other hands. I will come to you, I promise.
Thank you. Building on what you were saying about building a fortress economy, it seems to me that the new direction China is taking is to build up an autarky. Do you think, economically speaking, they're capable of doing it, or do you think they will need to reach out to, say, the semiconductor industry in Taiwan and take control of it, maybe not military, maybe politically, in order to do so? Or do you think that that's indeed what they're aiming for?
Thank you. Hi, really enjoyed your talk, very interesting. I guess my question is around international commodities trade. We saw how this tragic war that's still carrying on with Russia, Ukraine has impacted the way commodity prices have gone up, food, etc. So is the Western world now thinking, what are they thinking now? Because we know China has invested in Africa, Pakistan and many other countries for over a decade now. Does it change the way we look at energy supply, where we're going to, and nobody's talking about that point. So I'd be very interested to hear your views. Thank you.
And one more, the lady here.
Hi. I wanted to ask about the intelligence networks that China have been developing throughout some of the Asian Pacific region, particularly with the South China Sea, and also following on from that, just where they're going with the Belt and Road programs that have been going on, particularly through Africa and Asia over the last few years, and where you see that going from there.
Okay, so commodities, autarky, Belt and Road, intelligence. James.
Okay.
You don't have to answer all of them, but...
No, I don't. I have very kind of... I mean, they're all such great questions, but I'm afraid the answers are rather elusive. I think the autarky question will be the question of the next decade, and I really don't think it'll be settled, until several years have elapsed. So I just think that there's a trade-off between China moving down an increasingly authoritarian path as its securitization of everything view of the world demands, and the more US ramps up the pressure over Taiwan, etc., the more it goes into that threat mindset, the more dangerous it is for its economy, because as we've already seen, it's adopting a much more state-led, muscular type of, state-driven approach to all kinds of things like innovation, technology, who controls capital, the growth of the state-owned enterprises, the downfall of Alibaba and Ant Group and Tencent, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see where the Chinese economy is going, and I would argue that it's going in that direction primarily because of the overwhelming sense of threat that China has, and that's why it's building a fortress economy. But which will crash first? Will the Chinese economy crash because the fortress is unsustainable, or will it fight a war? Or, all of these are huge questions, but we just don't know the answer. Could I take a little bit of Belt and Road?
You may.
Okay. So Belt and Road is very interesting. It's become a huge debt problem now. A lot of defaults all over the Belt and Road. Some in Africa. China's just written off loans to, I think, 25 different African countries. It's embroiled in the Sri Lanka crisis. Pakistan is teetering on the brink of default. Pakistan, if you look at Pakistan's coverage of, foreign exchange reserves, they're about 1 or 2 months of imports at the moment. It's right on the brink of a big default, and you probably know Pakistan, I think, is the second biggest borrower under the Belt and Road after Venezuela, and look what's happened in Venezuela. There's a massive meltdown that's already several years old. So what China's doing, I think, is de-emphasizing Belt and Road, not shutting it down completely, but de-emphasizing it, and it's now launched 2 parallel initiatives. One's called the Global Development Initiative, and the other's called the Global Security Initiative. Nobody is really sure, though UGA is actually, I think, one of the leading experts, just written a column about it for the FT, on what these are. It's sort of left hanging out there. We don't really know what they are, but we think, at least I think, that China is slowly pivoting from Belt and Road to these 2 types of initiatives.
I would completely agree with that, but again, you can see the arc of Belt and Road investment. It was launched in 2013, and it had 5 years of exuberance and substantial investment. Most of it in energy, and most of that in fossil energy. But it peaked, 4 years ago, and has been in decline ever since. And as James said, now the major problem is managing debt. Why debt? Well, I always find it interesting with Belt and Road to remember the situation of Japan in the mid-90s. A lot of China's, great ideas are actually, have been tried before. And Japan in the mid-90s had a very, similar set of problems. It was overbuilt in infrastructure. It had a lot of surplus capacity. It had an aging population. And it had the bright idea of building infrastructure across Asia, maybe, setting up a bank to finance it and all of that. And it still does build a lot of infrastructure, but the difference was that Japan, being a market economy, had to do a lot of due diligence about what it invested in. And not all infrastructure creates value, or it pays for itself. And Japan had to exert more discipline in that regard. China bragged about, having no conditions. It bragged about non-interference. We're not the kind of bossy Westerners who tell you, that you have to have conditions around this investment. And that has been part of the problem. A lot of it was sort of rather undisciplined high spirits, and the sense that the state would always, these are state-owned enterprises, they're state-owned banks, and the state would always kind of be at their back. And the conditions of investment were not always terribly generous. The interest rates were not particularly low in all cases. And so many of the host countries, found themselves in difficulties even before COVID. And of course, with COVID, that's become far more acute. So I think we've definitely had peak Belt and Road, and now it's going to be a lot of management of the aftermath. Just on the commodities trade and the decoupling, there's one aspect which we look at, which is, of course, rare earths and things like lithium. And, China has had a very, very strategic view of those essential commodities which are essential to the energy transition. China has in the past occasionally weaponized them. It did so over a dispute with Japan where it stopped export of rare earths. But the dilemma that Western economies now face is that, you know, they're committed to an energy transition which depends on China for essential supplies. And, you know, if things get really difficult with China, that could be very awkward, and it's not something that's very quick to remedy. On the decoupling, I mean, the idea that the Chinese economy could be an autarkic economy is it's quite a long way away, and it would also require a major re-engineering of our own economies, and particularly Germany. You know, Germany sells more cars, Volkswagen sells more cars in China than it does in the rest of the world. So Germany's kind of industrial base has been very, very tied to China. And, you know, the development of the Chinese economy is at a stage where, in any event, there was going to be a certain amount of reshoring because China's initial advantages of cheap labor and all of that, you know, the low-end manufacture, it had priced itself out of that quite a long time ago. And a lot of that has been redistributed to other smaller regional economies that are, you know, keen to take them on. But there is a limit to the amount of friendshoring and reshoring and that is going on. But what you do see, and you see it consistently in the reports of Western corporates in China, that there is a lot of promise fatigue, there's a lot of discouragement. You know, the promise of the Chinese market, you know, often dangled, not always delivered. So some companies, yes, but a lot of companies, not really. And so the investment decisions that they are making are extremely cautious or negative as far as China goes. So there's definitely a trend, but it's going to take a long time to play out.
Eugene?
Yeah, I mean, entirely agree with Isabel here. It's more aspiration, but also I see there's a permanent contradiction in here. On the one hand, if Beijing want to building a self-reliant economy and counting on homegrown technology talents, but all this great innovation or whatever China has been creating in the past few years based on its connectivity with the rest of the world, but not to put itself into isolation. So I think more sooner or later, part of the middle class in China would have to be really aware. You know, cutting off itself from the rest of the world is not really option, and sooner or later, the Chinese leadership will have to realize it is not really an option to cut itself from the rest of the world. So yes, autarky perhaps seems to be quite a long way away. Now, come back to the issue on the Belt and Road. I think the Belt and Road, we have seen a sea change already from 2019 onward, where the Chinese state did not pledge a single fresh capital at all putting money in, because they know the return on investment for the BRI has been extremely low, and it has been extremely unprofitable and badly managed. So they can't just using BRI as all-season foreign affairs slogan as such. So instead, you're now having this global development initiative, which has been introduced, I think it was 12 months ago. But so far, if you look into the amount of money that's spent on global development initiative, it seems far, far little compared with the BRI. So certainly what China is trying to do right now in here is to introducing a political narrative that could replace the BRI, but without spending all those money, and also to get a stamp from the United Nations to endorse that initiative. So I think that's perhaps is the priority. Now, come back to the question on China's relationship with the global south. Very interestingly, on the political report this year, Xi Jinping has dropped the term, the so-called new type of great powers, which is the term of reference referring China's relationship with Western liberal democracy. And for the first time, they have dropped that term. And what does that mean? That means that Beijing comes to the conclusion, really, the relationship with the West is, you know, much fraughted relationship are here to stay. Therefore, China will have to turn to the global south.
Okay, we've obviously lost Elizabeth permanently. Who knew that an internet connection with a hotel in Tokyo would be so bad? But so I apologise for that. We've got some questions at the front here. Gentleman here, lady here, guy here.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. I have got copies of Ghost Fleet and Wolf Warrior 2 on my devices. I hope that doesn't count as nerdism. My question is, what if China decides to go for the Crimea option rather than the option Russia took this year? What if it decides to go for Quemoy and Matsu and then try and bluff down and get away with no response from the West? and put the squeeze on Taiwan that way, which might, of course, be compatible with what the gentleman said earlier at the back about political pressure to get the semiconductor industry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next door.
Hi there. So just got a question about China's reliance on the US dollar. Do you think that China can reduce reliance on the US dollar? And if so, or if not, what are the consequences of that?
Pass it on. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was wondering about how the 20th Party Congress might affect the developing world. So would increased competition between the US and China and, for example, the new initiatives, the rather mysterious initiatives brought forth by China at the Congress, enable or hinder, I guess, smaller states, not so much developing world, the smaller states' ability to leverage both sides for their own economic and political gain? Or might this tension become an obstacle in the form of, for example, economic or proxy conflict?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so an incremental approach to reunification with Taiwan, the US dollar, and small states in the developing world. James is writing, so therefore it means he's got something to say.
I was just writing the questions down. Yeah, I think, you know, the thing about, I was just reading actually over the weekend a piece by a guy called John Culver or James Culver, used to be in the CIA in the US. It's freely available online. I can't remember which think tank it was, but it's interesting because it goes through all, well, not all, but several different scenarios of what a Chinese, I wouldn't say attack, but let's say China turning up the pressure on Taiwan would look like. And the interesting aspect of this to me is that there are so many different permutations and options, which is another reason why I think you know, the idea of saying boldly, predicting boldly China's going to attack is kind of a, you know, to me, it doesn't get at the nature of the problem. Anyway, and certainly taking Jinmen and Mazu is the type, one of those scenarios. Blockading Kaohsiung port is another scenario. Turning up the pressure economically, economic sanctions, appealing to those people in Taiwan that support the mainland, appealing to TSMC. You know, there are lots and lots of fairly peaceful or semi-peaceful, semi-threatening scenarios that China could engage in. You know, so the idea that you know we'll wake up one morning and China has missile attacked Taiwan is probably not, goodness knows, I mean, I'm not a military strategist, but my guess is that that might not be the first scenario that we should reach for. Yeah.
Yujie? I don't know which of maybe the role of the US dollar or...
Oh, okay.
or
Well, let me try that.
Countries in the developing world as well.
Okay, let me try this too. Take a first step on the US dollars. I mean, okay, Beijing has tried so hard to promote this renminbi internationalization, but what we come to realization now, it is going nowhere, because by being in the status, it's the so-called exorbitant privilege of US dollars, you don't need to have a demand of the currency. It's not a supply. I mean, you will never short of a supply for renminbi, but really in the market, you want to using renminbi as a demand, and perhaps is no. And secondly, this link back to the political system, that whether a political system is confident enough to allow to have open capital account, and so far, and China is going nowhere on this. And also quite interestingly on this political report, I remember previously 5 years ago, there was a term of reference on renminbi internationalization, and now that term has gone completely. And also this comes back to the personnel appointments and as well. You don't really find many people, there's actually hardly a single person in charge of banking and finance sector has made to the Politburo, and also there's only one for the Central Committee. So that is just to show you this currency issue will going nowhere. So that's why China feels so much under pressure, considering Russia's invasion towards Ukraine, that how it's going to diversify is treasure bond. It is not easy way to do. I mean, many years ago, China was hoping that euro could stood at the same position as US dollars, but that didn't happen. So it remained as to be a conundrum for Beijing, I would say.
Yeah, and interesting that you mentioned on the new Politburo the preponderance of PhDs in hard science, not finance. Isabel?
No, not much to add really. I mean, on Taiwan, it's always interesting to look back at China's actions in the South China Sea, where China has effectively militarized the South China Sea without provoking a military response from anyone. I mean, brief confrontation with Vietnam, but pretty sub-military. Essentially, it sunk a few fishing boats and so on, and it hasn't. It hasn't really been, it didn't get much pushback. So those tactics of, creeping kind of incrementalism, China's very good at that. And it will enact as much of that as it possibly can, certainly, I think, in Taiwan. I agree that, you can't have a major currency if it's not fully convertible, and, China's not able to do that. On the question of other countries leveraging the competition, it's my impression that certainly smaller countries in the neighborhood do not want to be forced to choose. So, this can be misplayed by the United States, trying to oblige countries to declare an allegiance, in a confrontation with China when China is the biggest neighbor and biggest trade partner of most of the smaller countries in the region and elsewhere. And that sort of competition can backfire. I don't think that US influence is a given. If you look at votes in the United Nations General Assembly, they absolutely do not these days go the way of the United States. Conversations that I've had recently in other countries, over things like Ukraine, reveal a depth of sympathy for Putin's position in people that you wouldn't necessarily think were thinking that way. So, I think we need to tread a little carefully here in our assumptions about influence and about how China and, to a certain extent, Russia can use their power. And, there's a lot of competition for influence. The West does not always put the money in. China will increasingly find it difficult to put the money in. But there have been, lots of cases of very small countries, indeed microstates, essentially bargaining over recognition of Beijing or Taiwan and, getting a one-off payout. But I think that without credible development policies, I think there's a limit to that influence.
Okay, we're starting to get towards the end of our time. There's a few hands still. There's two back there and the gentleman at the front here. And it's the editor.
Hi, thank you. So my question is, what standard or benchmark you're using to evaluate Chinese policy or Chinese action? Because apparently you are using many adjective words, and maybe you are comparing to something, for example, to a Western system. So like what benchmark you're using to evaluate that? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Chris. I work in the big tech sector and also advise some government branches. It is very clear to me from my observations and investigations that China is on course of a technological colonialization, not just in its neighboring countries, but also if you look at how much we use Chinese social media nowadays. All the Gen Z and millennials today are on TikTok. The data that we are giving to the CCP is enormous. And there's a lot of, inaction towards these things. There's a lot of talk about this, but very little inaction. What can we do about that, or in what ways, what would lead the Chinese government to be less aggressive in that world?
Thank you.
Thank you,
sir.
Yes. Do you think Chinese leadership was pleased to see the back of Donald Trump, or do they perhaps yearn for his return? And related to that, how do we think China really views Putin and Putin's current approach towards Ukraine?
Some big questions. The first one, I didn't quite understand, what is the benchmark? Could you just repeat, unless people understood on the panel, I didn't quite understand what you said.
Yeah, it's kind of relatively speaking, you are talking about something, you express your opinions, right? So you are using any standard, or from what perspective you are evaluate Chinese policy or Chinese action?
Okay.
Is it clear?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Well, speaking personally, I look at China from, I've been studying China for more decades than I care to admit to. And in terms of evaluating the recent developments that we've been talking about, my reference points are past policies in China, experience of Mao Zedong era, through Deng Xiaoping era, through, all of that. So you look at, if you're trying to judge today, you look at, how you compare it to 10 years before, 20 years before, and that's the only sensible way to do it, in my view. But I'm sure there are other useful contributions that people can make.
We had tech, we had Donald Trump, and we had Vladimir Putin. All in the same sentence.
I'd honestly rather not talk about Donald Trump, but on Putin, I found it quite interesting in the recent summit in Kazakhstan that Putin acknowledged publicly Chinese concerns. Those concerns had not been expressed publicly by China, but presumably had been expressed quite forcefully in private. We all know the history of Russia, China, Sino-Soviet relations. It's a pretty, up and down story. I don't think that, I would guess that Xi Jinping is not entirely thrilled with the way things have gone in Ukraine, because China still needs a fairly stable and prosperous world, for its own reasons. So there's not much to cheer here. And, some of the things that have been said by Russian leaders and Russian policymakers and on Russian television are pretty alarming for China. So I think not entirely thrilled, I would say. As for Trump, I couldn't begin to guess.
James, you're the editor of Tech Asia as well as your FT hat, so maybe you could address the technology
Oh, the
issue.
TikTok one? Okay. Yeah, sure. I think we're just beginning to see the contours of what is going to happen with data regulation. And interestingly, China has got in first on this. There were 3 data protection laws pushed through, I believe, last year and the year before in China. One is called the Data Security Act, and it covers huge amounts of different aspects of data. So China has, actually, Xi Jinping, to give him credit, has noticed the vulnerability of data flows as long ago as 2013, when he gave a speech saying, foreigners getting hold of our data is something we should be very worried about. And China has imposed a very strong data protection system now. If you work, let's say, for a brokerage house or a company in China, you have to get specific approval to send documents abroad. It really is that tough. We in the West are lagging behind, but I think that we will have no option but to impose similar types of data security regimes that China has already done. And some of the foothills of this, I think you can already see. Huawei is supposed to be stripped out of the UK's basic telecoms infrastructure network, but I think there's a lot more coming down the track.
Sure. On that question on which benchmark, and I think it's an ontological question, so looks like someone from LSE asked this question, my previous place. Which benchmark do you use? Official documents, and you always have to read between lines. You don't accept things as they are. You have to read between lines. And then you also have to compare the changes of the language from several documents in the past, whether you see any sense of consistency or immediate change, and therefore signaling fundamental policy shift. So that's really my line, the way how I work. I go through the original public available sources. And I do not collecting rumors because I just found those rumors are unfounded and I heard and I don't know where to get them from anyway. Now on Trump and Putin, I don't know. I mean, none of them are very good options for Xi Jinping anyway. I think Beijing would be really perhaps for Beijing's worst nightmare would be a Trump comeback or Republican comeback. At the end of the day, there isn't really much differences between Republicans' policy or Democrats' policy, but I think at least for Democrat, that seems to be more sophisticated and the way that China can dealt with, but for Republicans, it's just purely blatant that China threat, and they seem to want to, in Beijing's view, or in Beijing's words, to contain China's so-called unstoppable rise. So I think Trump comeback or Republican comeback is the worst nightmare for Beijing, and that means perhaps the so-called Taiwan question will rock the boat in here. Now, come back to Putin, and I'm afraid this perhaps is the major diplomatic misgiving Xi Jinping has been made in the last 10 years, probably one of the major diplomatic misgiving. And none of us really expected this war to last for so long. Now, for China, having Russia that has a stable economic relationship with the West, Russia would be Beijing's best friend. But by having a neighbor that is constantly have such a fraught relationship with themselves, it is Beijing's worst nightmare, perhaps. Just think about the two countries share borders around 4,500 kilometers. It's the width of Europe. It's the distance between here and Edinburgh. So what China trying to do? China would have to consider if it cannot handle Russia well. That is perhaps Beijing's biggest national threat, and therefore that prompted Beijing to make that choice, but very unfortunate choice, on the 24th of February.
Okay, we've pretty much run out of time, but I know there's one question at the back, I think. Was there a hand right at the back that's been up for ages? In that case, the honour goes to the guy in the blue shirt for the last question, a +1 from me.
Thank you. A comment first, the comment being economic coercion is a very punchy, meaningful tool. If China turns into an autarky, it's tantamount, in my opinion, to them taking their best striker off the field. My question is about equality. Over the last 40 years, as Dong predicted, a lot of people in China have got rich before others. What does the future look like from an equality point of view in China? Thank you.
Okay, so a question on equality, and just one last question from me. I just wanted to ask about the zero COVID policy, because it was very personally endorsed by Xi, and of course very unpopular in Shanghai, and yet the party chief in Shanghai has now been promoted to the Politburo, or the Standing Committee of the Politburo. So how dangerous is the zero COVID policy internally, and where do you think that's going? So on that question and on inequality, if you can then wrap up gracefully, we will release James to edit his piece for tomorrow's paper, which we'll all read with interest. Isabel.
Yes, on zero COVID, there is no backing off zero COVID. People are very fed up with zero COVID. We see, complaints and protests wherever it happens. But it's having, lots of effects. If you think of Western supply chains, you can suddenly have your supply chain entirely shut down because there is one case, in one place, and the whole neighborhood shuts down. You're having these awful incidents like the bus crash where people were taken off in the middle of the night, again because there was one case. The bus crashes, and the image that circulated on China's social media was a man in a hazmat suit spraying the wreckage of the bus, and this is sort of pretty pathological. The reason they can't relax it is that they have refused to license or import mRNA vaccines. The Chinese vaccines are slow to make it. They haven't managed to develop their own, and they have a very vulnerable elderly population. So and actually the health system couldn't cope with an epidemic. So they're a bit stuck unless they license mRNA or unless there's a kind of miracle cure. I'm afraid they're stuck with it, and that's.
But the political control is tight enough that.
The political control is tight enough, but of course, all of those things have a cost. Political control has a cost, and zero COVID has an economic cost. So I think until the end of 2023, I can't see much relaxation on zero COVID, I'm afraid.
James?
Inequality. I think inequality is a really interesting topic. And I think it's one of those situations where if you take a step back and look at what China's trying to do, it really makes a lot of sense. I think nobody would dispute the fact that the very rich in China are hugely rich. I mean, if you look at the Gini coefficient, you'll see that it's one of the most unequal countries in the world in terms of wealth and income. So Xi Jinping's common prosperity, it's very little defined at the moment, but I would caution against thinking that that might mean that it doesn't mean anything. I think that some of the biggest Chinese policies in the past have come with the most vague heralding, you know. If we try to think what it might mean, I think it gets really fascinating. Just consider for a minute, there's 600 million people in rural China. And rural China in terms of property assets is a rather inert space. For instance, you're not allowed to sell a homestead, like a farm. In Chinese, it's called jiaijidi, right? You're not allowed to sell your homestead, so your house and about an acre of land around it. But if that was to be liberalized, as it has been in certain test areas in Guangdong province and some other places, you could see a really huge explosion of capital creation, value creation, because you've got the houses of 600 million people that can suddenly be traded for money. So it would turn from an inert asset into a valued asset. The other thing that could happen in rural China is, as I mentioned earlier, social welfare. You know, so proper healthcare, proper pensions, pension funding, which would create, of course, huge amounts of money that then could be invested in stock and bond markets. I mentioned the misgivings that Xi Jinping has about welfareism, but let's say that changes, or let's say when they push through common prosperity, they decide to at least tweak it in the case of the rural Chinese economy. So what I'm really leading to is a big question mark. If China was to go down this path, I believe it could unlock a source of growth that could change a lot of the arguments that I've personally been making on this panel, which is that China's economy is stagnating somewhat and is in a structural period of stagnation. I think that if they really went for it and they energized rural China, they could unlock a growth driver that could last another 10, 15 years. So I think it's a really, really interesting question. Unfortunately, we don't have any of the answers. Everything I said is speculation.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I ended in a very funny joke. I mean, I often say this to many German friends of mine. Contemporary China, Chinese society shaped by two Germans. First one is Karl Marx, you know, the founder of communism, but the second one is Karl Lagerfeld, the designer of Chanel. And that is the two modern China for you, and that is a question Xi Jinping will have to answer, irrespective of how long he will stay in the office. Hence, you have the common prosperity. And what I found also, the 2/3 of the Chinese population are made up by peasants and farmers. They're not those urban citizens that you're seeing on TV in Shanghai. They're actually those farmers that deeply support to Xi Jinping himself. And therefore, at the end of the day, I think if Xi Jinping realized that would be his key constituency, the policy will be pivot towards the rural areas. I mean, again, asking you to have a look on the political report of this year. The section on rural area seems to be far more well advanced and developed than compared with the whatever the economic model we're talking about in here. So I think Xi Jinping really had in mind, in order to sustain himself or sustain the Communist Party's legitimacy, and perhaps they have to pick up that old trick where the party come from the farmers. So I think, again, we're now seeing that era return.
Well, look, we could go on and on because there's so much to talk about. We haven't talked about Hong Kong. We haven't really talked about human rights. We haven't said very much on climate change and China's massive role in that. But we have run out of time for today. So thank you very much indeed for coming to the Conduit Club. Thank you for watching online. And please give a warm round of applause to our expert panelists.